Morals in Man, Part 2. Full actuality in man, then, demands the perfection of body, senses, mind. It demands, too, the perfection of heart and will, for, as St. Thomas put it, knowledge is only perfect when it passes into love. It demands, finally, the perfection of action, and the point for the moment is the right order as Thomism sees it, that it is what one is that matters most. What does, what knows, what is. Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, commenting in 1916 on Browning's Death in the Desert, said, "There is no mistaking what Browning means, nor in what degree of hierarchy he places this, that, and the other." Does it not strike you how curiously men today, with their minds perverted by hate, are inverting that order? All the highest value set on what does, what knows, suddenly seems to be of importance, but only as important in feeding the guns, perfecting explosives, collaring trade, all in the service of what does, of get on or get out, or of efficiency. No one stopping to think that efficiency must be, a relative term. But still the whisper, not ridiculous in its day, will assert itself, that what is comes first, holding and upholding by God. What is at once the object of philosophy and the object of practical endeavor? Thomism is the philosophy of being, not least in that it values being, let us say in the human sphere, the person, above efficiency and productivity and results. Because in this single principle of potentiality and actuality, being and non-being, its problems in every department of thought are resolved. Unity, goodness, truth, beauty, these things are but different aspects of that single reality. Beauty is being which has not been robbed of its three qualities, wholeness, harmony, and radiance, in which according to St. Thomas, beauty consists. The whole thing, not stunted or maimed, but harmoniously developed and fulfilled, not warped or disordered, but radiant with health, physical or spiritual, or what corresponds in inanimates to these, complete fulfillment. It is the beauty thing. And ugliness is non-being, the privation of being, because the privation of these due qualities. As moral evil is the privation of that being we call goodness. To say that evil is non-being is not, of course, to adopt the Strothio-Cameline tactics of Christian Science and deny, let us say, the reality of pain. Disease exists, just as sin exists, but as sinful action as a physical entity is good, and indeed the sinful action is often physically identical with the virtuous action, and is the striving after the desiring of a good thing, its evil consisting in the lack of right, of the physical, or of right ordering towards the good, and therefore in a lack of being. So a Bunyan is being, and therefore of itself good and doubtless beautiful, but in its context it denotes a lack, a privation of the proper shape and texture and complexion of a foot, and is therefore in that sense a lack of being. It is, then, on the distinction of actual and potential in regard to the essence of the finite, and its relation to the infinite that the Thomist ethic is built. A thing is good in so far as it becomes likened to God through the achieving of its perfection, its actualization. And with all creatures other than man and spirits, this presents no difficulty in the elucidation of means to end, for the way is dictated by nature and instinct. But man is rational and self-determining. The problem of free will arises, and natural necessity becomes moral obligation. Moreover, the complex structure of the human being and the variety of his potentialities make right direction of all activity, even when end is truly apprehended, a matter of infinite difficulty. It is no good trying to achieve perfection in one department of life and ignoring another. The whole will be spoiled, as with King John, of whom the schoolboy said that he was considered a bad king because he was vicious in his private life. It is easy to be mistaken about the end of life, but suppose we have a right estimate of that, and the will to attain it. In what does the good life consist? Clearly, if the end is the actualization of our potentialities, it will consist in activity congruous with the attainment of that actualization. The right action is what is according to nature, that is, to reason, and Ronsard was surely arguing a moral lesson when he counseled the visitor to the grave of Rabelais, the bon biberon, to lay not lilies, however freshly plucked, but cups and flagons on the tomb. But the goodness is not in isolated actions. For just as science is not a mere accumulation of facts, but the actualization of the faculty of right judgment, so virtue is not merely a succession of good actions, but the actualization of the faculty of willing and acting well. And just as knowledge is not one of the accidental perfections which go to make up the total actualization of the personality, the substance as a whole, so of virtue, and it is in the acquisition of virtue, the good disposition, that actualization in the ethical sphere is most apparent and most important, the perfection of being under its aspect of goodness. For St. Thomas, the good is the primary concept. The right is determined by it and not vice versa, and the way to moral completion is ultimately the way, through asceticism and struggle, to a unified orientation of the will towards the infinite God. Man, said Aristotle, is a political animal, which is not the same thing as a politician. The Thomist theory of politics should be touched on here, so far as is necessary to remark its debt to the principle under consideration. Thomism stands halfway between the contrary theories of liberalist individualism, in which admits no natural duty in the individual towards society, and collectivism, which admits no rights of individuals against society. The fact is that man cannot as a rule live the best life in isolation. He needs society, and this exigency of nature connotes a corresponding duty towards society. As an individual, he forms a unit of a larger whole, and he is therefore obliged, morally, for politics is subordinate, in the Thomist view, to ethics, to work for the actualization of the whole. On the other hand, as a person, a self-subsistent, he has rights which the society cannot abrogate, and under this aspect he is not for the society, but the society is for him. Those potentialities which we might call social, the potentialities towards the perfections which are only to be acquired through life in society, are to be actualized by means of society. In each case, the one principle receives a new expression, and in the supernatural society of whose existence we learn from faith another and far greater one, for then it is the potentiality to supernatural life itself, which is fulfilled by membership in the mystical body of Christ, while the society in and through its members comes to the fullness of the stature of Christ. Finally, the same principle is the key to the Thomist sociology. There is a temptation, in face of the spiritual chaos into which industrialism has plunged us, to argue that we ought to jettison our material riches, the fruits of the advance of science, and return completely to the simple, unmechanical life. It is questionable whether such a step, even if it were possible, would be right. A rightly ordered material or mechanical advancement means the actualization of much of the somewhat of possibility in the nature of man. To disown the possibility of achieving it would be to disown reason, to turn our faces in the direction not fulfillment, but of decay. What is wrong, as has been so often pointed out, is that our material advance has in fact been wrongly directed, has not been accompanied by a parallel actualization of the spiritual, so that our social structure is the wrong sort of structure, our machinery largely the wrong sort of machinery, our jobs often the wrong sort of jobs. What is necessary is that we catch up, for the spiritual ought to be governing the material, not lagging behind it. It is the emergence of these various forms of a single principle, supplying from a single source a key to such diverse problems, and so uniting the boundless manifold of experience into a coherent whole, that the speculative value of Thomism principally consists. As to its practical value in order the world of affairs, two facts remain perhaps emerge from the consideration of its program, to speak only of its extrinsic claims to a hearing. First, that it is not a dead medieval system, suitable perhaps for the days of Pope and Emperor, but not for the 20th century. Secondly, that at least it does offer a way to order, and the tranquility of order is the definition of peace. If we understood better the Aristotelian and Thomist principle, so the Thomist will argue, if we acknowledge the hierarchy which it implies, the primacy of the spiritual, if we grasped more fully its view of the nature and end of and right activity of man and the claims of God, perhaps we should come to love contemplation better, and see the world more clearly, and so make our activity contemplations overflow and servant, and help more effectively to cure the chaos and strife and disruption which are ruining the world. Chapter 3. The Problem of Freedom. It was said that the ill-starred Baron Thunder Ten Tronckh said that he was the most puissant seigneur in Westphalia because his country seat could boast a door and some windows. This preeminence over his neighbors, implying as it does a corresponding responsibility, provides an excellent text on which to hang the ethical discussion. It is, inasmuch as men are not doorless and windowless nomads, that any ethic of responsibility has meaning. The rational being has the faculty, so at least the majority of philosophers have held, of securing information from without and of initiating movements from within, of knowing and of acting. The Baron, one imagines, would emerge from his mansion not at random but of set purpose. Action, to be properly speaking human, must be purposeful and directed. Not only, however, must each action have its purpose, the whole succession of actions which make up a man's life must be unified by some common aim if his life is to have coherent meaning. Activity and the motives which produce activity must be synthesized. It is the Thomist belief that no order and happiness can be achieved until economics and politics are synthesized under the ethical principles. But before that is possible, there must clearly be an adequate ethic, an ethic which displays not one aspect of the truth only, or several, but the truth in its entirety. St. Thomas's genius was preeminently for synthesis, and it is often said that genius is nowhere so apparent as in his ethical teaching. The Thomist becomes, as he studies other great ethical systems, more and more amazed at the way in which the proposition he feels to be true in them are incorporated organically in the Thomist synthesis, so as not merely to throw light on other aspects of the truth, but to become themselves more convincing and more full of meaning. The Merchant of Venice is greater than all the stories which Shakespeare used to make it, not least because of the synthetic power with which he interwove them. One is tempted to say the same of the Thomist ethic. Evelyn Underhill wrote of religions, "We must not claim the discovery of the reality as the monopoly of any one system of religion, but we can and ought to claim that no system shall be held satisfactory which does not find a place for it." Similarly, in an ethic which, however true as far as it goes, does not offer a solution to every aspect of the ethical problem, cannot be wholly satisfactory. Integrity is the hallmark of truth. "He leads the just and holy life," said St. Augustine. "Qui rerum integer estimator est," who judges all things with integrity, with wholeness. The following pages attempt, on one hand, an inquiry into the number of ethical systems, with a view to discovering in them both a necessary element of truth and an essential defect, and on the other hand, an examination of the Thomist theory in the light of that inquiry. One of the simplest answers to the ethical problem is, of course, the theory of determinism, since it denies the problem. There can be no question of duty or accountability if one's action is extrinsically determined, and at first sight the doctrine is comfortable. But the denial of the problem includes the denial of freedom, and this is surely less acceptable. The greatest sacrifice a man can make is that of his own free will. As Aeneas Sylvius knew when visiting the Benedictine monastery, he cried, "Ah, how happy are those who live in so beautiful a place, but how much happier those who, having seen, can go away again." Yet is free will really a delusion and no more, a bubble which the determinist has effectively pricked. Determinism assumes, in the history of ethical theory, a variety of forms. There is mechanical determinism, which holds that all our actions are the result of merely mechanical forces. There is a physiological determinism, which regards them in terms of reflex action. There is psychological determinism, which holds that action is the result of the will's obedience to the strongest motive, or, in other words, of its pursuit of greatest good. There is theological determinism, which holds that God imposes upon the will the course it shall pursue, and that each soul therefore is inescapably predestined to heaven or to hell. Again, the good at which a man is, according to these theories, determined to aim, and it must be a good of some sort, for, as Aristotle remarked, those who object that at which all things aim is not necessarily good are, we may surmise, talking nonsense. This good has been very differently described. For some thinkers it is a pleasure. Eudoxus was of his opinion, who thought, as Aristotle, attacking him, says, that pleasure was the good because he saw all things, both rational and irrational, aiming at it. But between two pleasures, one that will draw the will, on his theory, which is the greater, the more intense, for no qualitative factor can be admitted, else it is at once admitted that pleasure is not the good, but only one of many goods. John Stuart Mill, who, after his conversion of 1826, leaned more and more away from the utilitarianism of Bentham and his father and towards the idealism of Coleridge, recognizing qualitative differences in pleasures, and so ennobled the ethics of hedonism. Though at the expense of its fundamental hypothesis, the illogically of his position he tried to remedy by argument that other motives were due to habit, and that altruism was in fact egoism. For since the happiness of each is the good of each, the happiness of all is the good of all, a fallacy from distributive to collective term, which will not bear scrutiny. But at least the principle of altruism emerged. Quite apart, however, from the nature of the good pursued, Thomism is at variance with these views in holding that man is striving ever after it does so freely. That position should be briefly reviewed. In the first place, the free, in the sense here taken, is not the same as the spontaneous. The growth of a tree is spontaneous. The immobility of a man in a pillory is not. Spontaneity is freedom from external force. It does not imply free will. This latter demands, in addition, that there shall be no determination even from within. The plant is not in this sense free, for it is determined by its own structure to this line of development, and not that. The acorn can become an oak, but not an elephant. The man has freedom of such a kind that he himself can decide whether to do or not to do a certain action, and as between two possible alternatives, decide on this rather than on that. Every irrational creature, it may be said that it naturally pursues some given particular good, as the unconscious urge in the acorn is in the direction of oakhood. As the dog instinctively chases after the bone, cats pursue mice. For what is presented to cognitive consciousness, and therefore to volition, or what corresponds analogously to volition, is a good of a certain sort, but man has a larger horizon. He can appreciate this good and that, brandy and bock, and the exhilaration of walking in the teeth of the wind, but what raises him above the level of instinctive and unconscious entities is the faculty of discerning in these things the ratio of their goodness, of isolating in the good thing the goodness of the thing, and thence coming to the awareness of goodness in itself, of what is called the universal good as fulfilling in itself the whole possible content of the idea of good, and so answering in itself the quest of all possible desire. The will is thus not drawn merely to this and to that. At the core of its volitions is the desire of goodness as such, and therefore fruition, the fulfillment of all desire, cannot be attained completely except in the attainment of that universal object. Now, as every nature has, in the Thomist view, a determined end in which it determinedly born, and as the will itself can be considered like anything else as a nature, so the will has its proper end to which it is determinedly born, precisely that universal good which lies in the fulfillment of desire. The dog, faced with the bone, cannot resist its appeal. The will of man, faced with the universal good, is equally irresistibly drawn. But on the other hand, as one isolated chemical, let us say, from among those which make up the bone, will not necessarily attract the dog, so one isolated, particular good will not necessarily draw the will. The good as such determines the will ut natura, as a nature. The particular good leaves freedom of choice to the will ut ratio, as rational. I may say speculatively that genus is good. I may even say speculatively that genus is good for me, but I shall not drink the Guinness unless I go to make a further practical decision. St. Thomas's analysis of a deliberate human act is subtle and profound. He distinguishes the one act whereby I see, isolate, choose and attain a good, 12 months, and from the first apprehension of it a good to the final fruition which supervenes upon successful activity in its pursuit. Man as cognitive is concerned only with the discovery and apprehension of the true, or, where the mind is creative as an art, with the fashioning of forms. Man as conative is concerned only with the attaining of the good. Cognition without volition would never issue an action. Volition without cognition is impossible. Thus, in the genesis of a human act, there is progressive interplay of both faculties. The first moment is the merely speculative apprehension of a good, let us say, at the sight of a glass of brandy. The judgment, brandy is good, immediately follows a simple propensity or complacientia of the will, and the intellect is led thereby to judge of the possibility of attaining the good and assert its goodness here and now. It would be a good thing to get down to it. Cognition has passed from purely speculative to the practical. Volition now centers on the adoption of necessary means to the desired end. The mind is moved by this further step to ponder upon them. The will then accepts the means presented and instigates a further consideration which results in the judgment that this particular policy, rather than that one, is the best suited to the attainment of the end desired. The stretching out of the hand, let us say, the tilting back of the head. On this, the will now centers itself, and moves the intellect to issue its orders to arm and neck, and makes these orders operative. The members obey. The brandy floats upon the palate and down the throat. The end is attained. The will rejoices in fruition. These steps are, of course, only the moments, isolated by analysis, of a single, possibly instantaneous act. They serve to explain how apprehension can become effective pursuit, how the vague propensity becomes centered upon a single means to a single object. But where in this analysis does free will enter? Suppose the good apprehended to have been universal good. Each step would have followed of necessity. For the universal good, being by definition beatitude, that which satisfies all desire, at no point could there have been a refusal to aim at its attainment, since a refusal would simply that there was some other good to be preferred, if only the good of abstention, and hence that the universal good did not in fact correspond to every disease. But with the glass of brandy, this is not, we think, the case. Where does the possibility of another choice arise? Clearly in the practical judgment. This is good for me here and now. The particular good does not draw to itself all desire. It is not all good, but under one aspect good, and another not good. A glass of water offers itself as an alternative. Speculatively, I do not hesitate to judge that brandy is better than water, but practically it is not so simple. If I take the brandy, perhaps I shall rue it in the morning, or perhaps there is the anger of a wife to be thought of. 100 factors may intervene to present the brandy in an evil light. If then only an object which is wholly desirable is necessarily pursued, if, on the other hand, any object other than the universal good must appear, practically, as both desirable and undesirable, then its pursuit is not necessary, but free. Mere apprehension of it as attainable will not do the trick. The practical judgment, this is the good for me, must be imposed somehow upon the judging faculty, and by what other than the will? Thomism will concede to the psychological determinist that the will is determined to one object by the greatest good of the alternatives presented here and now. But it contends that the judgment, this is the greatest good here and now, is made, unlike all speculative judgments, under the influence of the will. Here we are met by Buridan's donkey, who died of starvation between 2 pecks of oats, being unable to make up his mind which to eat. And Leibniz objected that if, in fact, the will has not determined to act by the greatest good presented to it, it would be impossible to act at all, for there would be no sufficient reason for choice. To which argument it is replied that if there is no objective reason, supposing the 2 objects to be equally desirable, there is nevertheless a subjective reason. In the case of the donkey, the advisability of choosing one or the other than dying between the 2. But the theological determinist also has a card to play. True, he may concede, the object itself does not force the will, but its choice is none the less determined, for man can act at all only because God, from whom is both being and consequent activity, moves it to act. This is the teaching of Thomism itself. But for St. Thomas, God moves things in accordance with the nature he has given them, and it is conceivable that he should do otherwise. It is inconceivable that the author of nature should be the author of what is unnatural. Man's nature is rational. That is, he can apprehend the nature of goodness and the particularity, the imperfection, of particular goods. And to these latter, therefore, he is not of necessity drawn. Hence it is of his nature to be free with regard to them, and it must be in accordance with the freedom that God moves him. The impulse is infallible, but it is free. It covers not only the act, but the mode of the act. I am infallibly moved to drink, but I am infallibly moved to drink freely. An apparent paradox, a mystery, yet the principle is unassailably clear. The universal conviction which men have of their freedom is thus supported by metaphysical argument. So, too, is the further contention, of which Kant made so much, that the conviction we have of responsibility cannot be a delusion, and that it necessarily implies, therefore, the reality of freedom which is in its condition. I cannot be accountable, responsible, if I am not free. But I am accountable, therefore I am free. Ought implies can, and the reality of the former implies the reality of the latter. But if these arguments are valid, is discussion at an end? Does not a little introspection reveal the fact, startling perhaps, that little of what we do is purely rational, deliberately motivated and chosen? We act, half of our time, from mechanical habits, actions which St. Thomas would not allow to be true human acts in the complete sense, and called instead actus hominis. Sometimes an action we have been doing over and over and over again, perhaps for years, without thinking about it, suddenly presents itself for the first time to the mind as something to be weighed and judged. We see it then for the first time objectively, and begin to ask ourselves whether it is right and good. We act from irrational prejudice, as a man may unconsciously acquire a tribalist outlook in religion, and imagine the adherents of all other religions to be in league with the devil. We act from passion, as when Candide carved the name of Cunegonde on the trees. It has been said of the lover that he is determinist and behaviorist. Everything he does is motivated by love, because he has fallen in love with Clarissa, but he But did he choose to fall in love with Clarissa? Obviously not. Clarissa advances in all the pride of her sex appeal and incessu patuit die. The fort is stormed, the garrison, bewildered, bemused, surrendered, and all this takes place outside the kingdom of wills. The besieged can flee, of course, while there is yet time, but that is not part of the game itself, and in the game the victim is firmly tied in an extra-volitional sphere, as firmly as the bear waiting to be baited by the hounds. Again, how many crimes are fully deliberate in their commission, even when the criminal tendency is not to be regarded as a disease? The germ of thought insinuates itself, perhaps unconsciously, into the mind, secretly grows, becomes a force superior to and as though outside the personality, and the deed follows. At some point the project emerged into the realm of the conscious and the deliberate, but at what point? And was it not then too late? Was not the damage done below the conscious level? And not the imputability, if there is any, to be attached to some event or series of events long antecedent to the history of the crime itself? We act from pressure. Stone walls do not necessarily make a prison, but on the other hand there is durance in which the stone plays no part. There are prisons not made with hands. Rational routine is a necessity, and rationally accepted need not harm the personality. But it is possible, and today common, to accept the imposition of a routine which invests practically the whole of life, to become a cog. The fact that so many today are cogs in the social machine and are almost contented to be cogs is one of the worst things that can be said of our civilization. It means that whatever may be thought about free will, in fact it is scarcely operative. Add to the organization which pervades our lives the imposition of such opinions, as we can lay claim to by newspapers, censorships, convention, there is not much room for liberty. It is an old jibe that the Whigs succeeded, by a fraudulent promise of political liberty, in robbing the people of their economic independence. Today even the inward life of thought is in danger of ceasing to be one's own, of becoming the hypnopaedia of Brave New World. Even when our thoughts is free in the sense of not being dictated to us from without, we have to admit the force of the accumulation of influences which go to shape our general outlook. Heredity, environment, childhood experiences, inhibitions due to this, that, and the other cause, all these things color our judgment and at least help to dictate to us a line of conduct. Kant attempted to safeguard the autonomy of the will by setting it apart in the realm of the noumenal, leaving the phenomenal world to determinism. But it is precisely in the phenomenal world that all our actions take place, and it is in the confusion of passion, prejudice, pressure, and all other factors which militate against the full freedom of an act of the will functions. Violence, fear, passion, pathological states, these may, as St. Thomas taught, at least impede and diminish, perhaps wholly destroy freedom. Sort out from the day's activities those in which none of these factors plays a part, the will's autonomy will be found to have dwindled to sorry proportions. To put free will, then, at the basis of one's ethic, as St. Thomas does, is still to allow, as he does, no small place for determinism. On the other hand, given the fact of freedom and the possibility of regulation of action by the agent, the moralist is still only at the beginning of his inquiry. What are the principles of this regulation? When will free action be right? When wrong? Is the criterion to be found in the idea of duty or in the quest for happiness? Is the discovery of principles of ethical behavior a question of reasoning out means to an end, or of an intuition of the intrinsic character of rightness in each case? It is these problems which now must be discussed. Chapter 4. The Search for Happiness. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, chain of causes and effects, are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will but serve to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. Thus Bentham in the Principles of Morals, echoing Eudoxus and his disciples, which seem to show that in 20 centuries the discovery of truth has not been much advanced on this painstaking but obtuse globe. Oh, plutôt, as Voltaire put it, si globule. The determinist part of this view of matters, the chain of cause of effects, and the marvelous thing about human affairs is the concatenation of effects and causes. As Jacques Tournebroek said when the imprisonment of Brother Anga led to his learning Latin, this has already been discussed. Free will admitted there are two great lines of thought to be examined, the teleological, the deontological, respectively. The attempt to deduce moral principles from the idea of some end or good, or, on the other hand, from the idea of the right. For teleologists, in general, the criterion of moral behavior is the attaining of some end. But there are various types of end which present themselves to human appetition. For the hedonist, the end is pleasure and the absence of pain. At its least satisfactory, the theory envisages only sensuous pleasure. Least satisfactory because, apart from other considerations, it will hardly bear the test of experience. Tristis exutus voluptatum, said Boethius. Pleasure ends in sadness. There is always a morning after, and sooner or later every excitement palls. Mill's introduction of qualitative differences had already been noticed. He speaks of happiness at the end, but this he defines as an existence exempt as far as possible from the pain and as rich as possible in enjoyment, both in quantity and in quality, and explains it further as being not a life of rapture, but moments of such an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a predominance of the active over the passive, as having as the foundation of the whole not to expect more from life than it's capable of bestowing. The introduction of qualitative differences means that, in fact, the criterion is not pleasure but something else, as Mill's example of Socrates and the pig shows. A man would rather be a dissatisfied human being than a satisfied pig, which is the same as saying he would not choose pleasure at all costs, for, as Mr. Richard Hughes has remarked, one cannot wish for a more comfortable seat than an acquiescent pig. Mill goes further. I never indeed wavered, he says in the autobiography, in the conviction that happiness is the test of all rules of conduct and the end of life. But I now thought that this end was only to be obtained by not making it in the direct end. Those only are happy, I thought, who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness. One is reminded of the king's ambassadors who found Moustique playing with a young puppy and apparently as happy as the dog. It occurred to them to ask whether he was happy. Moustique was unable to answer, not having reflected on the subject of happiness. I will add, Mill says elsewhere, that in this condition of the world, paradoxical as the assertion may be, the conscious ability to do without happiness gives the best prospect of realizing such happiness as is attainable. For nothing except that consciousness can raise a person above the chances of life by making him feel that, let fate and fortune do their worst, they have not power to subdue him. St. Thomas, exhibiting what is marvelous about human affairs, explains the fact that the pursuit of pleasure defeats its own end by analyzing the nature of pleasure. Every pleasure is a property which follows upon beatitude or any part thereof. For a man has pleasure because he is in possession of some congruous good, in fact or in prospect or at least in retrospect. Pleasure is the accompaniment of congruous activity, as we are told of Ennius in the prologue to the third book of Pantagruel, that he, drinking, wrote, and writing, drank. Though this is a poor example, for writing is a congruous activity to some, and drinking to most, and pleasure the accompaniment in each case. That corporal pleasure alone would be the object of human activity, and its final end is a view in which St. Thomas quickly disposes. For the rational overtops the proportions of corporal matter, and that part of the soul which is independent of the bodily organs has the kind of infinitude with respect to the body and those parts of the soul created with it. Sense-awareness is awareness of a singular determined by matter, but the mind is a force absolved from matter and knows the universal. You cannot catch whales with a shrimping net. Bodily pleasure is not the end, for it cannot satisfy more than a part of the personality. Pleasure, in its widest extent, is not the end, for it is not only the accompaniment of the bonum conveniens, the congruous good, and to seek the property without the substance is to clutch at straws. We'll go a step higher in the teleological way. Mill himself had done so in one passage at least. The confusion of terms is great in English writers, for pleasure and happiness are not distinguished, as are delectatio and beatitudo in St. Thomas. But when Mill quotes from von Humboldt, the end of man is the highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole, he seems definitely to leave the realm of hedonism for what, since the days of Plato and Aristotle, has been called eudaimonism. The theory takes its name from the word eudaimonia, which Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle thought to be undeniably the end of man. If we translate this term happiness, we are liable to think of it as the sum of pleasures, an existence exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyment. But this is not what the Greek thinkers meant. They went on indeed to question whether happiness in this sense were not one of the elements of eudaimonia, but the term itself means something quite different. It denotes the perfected property activity of a nature, its full actualization. Sidgwick, after remarking what to avoid serious confusion, it is better to translate the word well-being or welfare, thus summarizing the thought of Aristotle. We observe that men are classified and named according to their functions. All kinds of man, and indeed all organs of man, have their special functions, and are judged as functionaries and organs to be in good or bad condition according as they perform their functions well or ill. May we not then infer that man has his proper function, and that the well-being or doing well that all men seek really lies in fulfilling well the proper function of man, that is, in living well through the normal term of man's existence, that life of the rational soul which we recognize as man's distinctive attribute. The whole basis of teleological ethics, the idea of moral action as the striving after an end to be attained rather than the achievement of conformity to a rule of right, is in this notion of well-being. Aristotle's discussion of the question begins, as is usual with him, in the everyday use of words. Every art and every inquiry, he says at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. For this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that which all things aim. The good is that which is desirable, that which fulfills desire. It is therefore after which all things strive, and this in turn is surely that for whose sake everything else is done. In medicine this is health, in strategy victory, in architecture a house, in any other sphere something else, and in every action and pursuit the end. For it is for the sake of this that men do whatever else they do. The right action, then, will be the good action, that is, the action which is conducive to the attainment of the end, and that end includes many elements, the fulfillment of many potentialities, so that we must not, if we are to be sound teleologists, exclude any one perfection. The criterion of the right is the good, and the good is the perfection of the whole man. This view of St. Thomas in substance accepted and incorporated into his own ethical theory. Yet as it stands it is open to objection, and may be understood in a sense which makes it wholly untenable. In the first place, it may be argued that it, as much as hedonism, is fundamentally egoist and cannot do justice to our conviction that altruism is an essential part of the good life. And of course, if the theory is to be understood in terms of a striving after one's own good, which admits of no recognition of the rights of others and of one's duty towards them, its failure must be evident. Such a quest, if indeed it were a quest for well-being, would obviously defeat its own end, for it can hardly be said that the selfish man is the perfect man. Such is the answer which eudaimonism is entitled to give to the objection, for altruism must be included among those aims, the sum of which is precisely that well-being which has well-doing as principal part. I cannot achieve my own perfection unless I perfect the somewhat of possibility in me as social animal. But this answer is again open to objection. It exonerates eudaimonism, it may be said, from the charge of objective egoism, but it leaves it open to the charge of a subjective egoist bias. You may not be exclusively engaged in the fact with your own, as opposed to others' good, but your viewpoint, even at your most altruistic, will be self-centered, for you view altruism itself in terms of your own perfection, and this argument is less easy to meet. It is of equal cogency against a more exalted form of eudaimism, that the more exalted, at least in appearance, since it brings God into the picture. St. Thomas as theologian translated Aristotle's notion of the perfection of the divinest part of man to the supernatural plane, as the Church had always equivalently done. The contemplation of speculative truth became the vision of God. His own thought on this must be returned to later. For the moment, a recurrent misunderstanding of the doctrine must be dealt with. The whole subject was profoundly discussed in Bishop Kirk's The Vision of God. Whatever is meant by this ubiquitous phrase of seeing, of knowing God, it certainly refers to some kind of inward or subjective experience. We have seen already how in much pagan thought such a subjective experience, as for example ecstasy, was taken as a constituting the whole of human endeavor. We shall see the same idea obtruding itself from time to time with disastrous results in the history of the Church. Such an attitude Bremen aptly called panhedonist, and no reflection is needed to convince us of the dangers which follow in its train. Once again, a man's thoughts and ideals converge upon himself. St. Paul set his face rigidly against any such perversion of the truth as this. He insists that experience in itself is of less importance than two other things: the love of God, the love by which it is conditioned on the human side, and God's loving care for man, which alone makes it possible on the other. The most explicit passage of all marshals the two thoughts for a direct attack upon the Corinthian pride in gnosis. We know that we have gnosis puffed up, but love edifieth. There is, after all, not so much difference between this seeking for the vision of God, which is really only seeking of self, and the most pedestrian form of mundane hedonism. Can the situation be saved by arguing that the vision of God is in fact only to be attained by the way of virtue, and that virtue necessarily implies the opposite of self-seeking? Hardly. For the pursuit of virtue itself may be a form of self-seeking, an indulgence in the delices d'un bonne oeuvre, even virtue of the most self-denying kind. Do we not indeed touch up here one of the most subtle dangers which threaten the life of the Spirit? St. Thomas holds that the growth of the Spirit in the love of God is in one sense like the growth of the body, which passes from infancy through childhood to manhood, and he therefore distinguishes in it three stages: that of the incipientes, the beginner, whose principal concern is with the eradication of vice; that of the proficientes, those who are progressing, and whose concern is mainly with the growth of the virtues, the strengthening of charity; that of the perfecti, those who have reached spiritual manhood, who desire to be dissolved and be with Christ, and who, though they continue to progress in the virtues, do not make this progress their principal care, but in complete disinterestedness strive simply to ut Deo inhererant, to cleave to God. And as the essence of charity is self-forgetfulness, self-giving, so even in the lower stages of the Spirit's journey, it is the last stage which must be held in mind and aimed at, lest on the pretext of serving God, we really do no more than satisfy a spiritual craving for results, counterpart to the lust for efficiency in material things which is ruining our world. There is a policy of get-rich-quick in the spiritual as well as in the worldly sphere, and it is ultimately anti-Christian. St. Dominic prayed to be a stone blocking the mouth of hell. We are to concern ourselves with the eradication of evil and the growth of goodness, but we must not turn the path of virtue into a process for self-aggrandizement. If we do, religion will cease to be what by definition it must be, theocentric, and become egocentric. Recollection will become introspection. Mysticism will give place to ceaseless anxiety as to what precise stage of sanctity the soul has reached. The wholly disinterested adoration and worship of the transcendent will become mere self-indulgence, and the positive striving after closer union with God will be lost in the negative preoccupation with the avoidance of breaches of a code. In whatever form the idea of service be articulated, whether in praise or prayer or preaching or devotion to the temporal needs of others, it cannot be achieved by a soul whose immediate attention is absorbed by the warfare against itself. Its aim is positive and not negative, constructive rather than destructive, self-forgetful rather than self-centered, and to such an aim, the soul which is absorbed in self-culture can never hope to attain. Self-culture, it is the same objection as before, and it should certainly put us on our guard against the possible perversion of piety.